Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Courage Conversation Show. I'm your host, Ashley Easter. I'm the founder and executive director of Courage 365, and we have a great show planned for you tonight. Elaina Ramsey is here with us, and I met Elaina. I don't know, when I pull her on the screen, we'll have to talk about that. It was several years ago through the Red Letter Christian organization doing justice work and kind of seeing the way that she's leading within that movement. And she also does a lot of other really powerful things, activist work. She's a survivor herself. And so I'm just going to really quickly read her bio just so you can get to know her a little bit more before we bring her on screen. So Elaina Ramsey, she, her, serves as the executive director of the Ohio Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. With over a decade of advocacy, grassroots organizing, and communications experience in faith and politics, Elaina loves listening to people's stories and engaging communities for social change. She holds a master's degree in both theological studies and international peace and conflict resolution. A former fundamentalist evangelical, Elaina practices compassionate care as a pro-faith, pro-family, pro-choice Christian. In 2021, Elaina was honored by the United Church of Christ with a Movement Maker Award for her pastoral and prophetic work in advancing religious and reproductive freedom. So without further ado, let me invite Elaina onto the show. Hey, Elaina, thanks so much for being here.
Wonderful to be here with you, Ashley. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is such an honor to speak with you. And I was trying to think what year we first met. Was it maybe 2016? I'm trying to
Yes,
think.
definitely shortly after
Yes,
that. Yes, it's been a minute, but
it has been.
somewhat.
Yes, yes. And I'm just continually inspired by the work that you're doing. I feel like you pop up in so many different places. Like when I was researching questions for this conversation, I was seeing you like all the different articles you've written about and different campaigns and organizations you're involved in. And I love that activist spirit about you. And I knew I needed to bring you on the show because you have such a deep compassion and care for survivors. And I also know that you are a survivor yourself. And before this interview, we had chatted just briefly about you sharing a little bit of your story as you feel comfortable. So, for everybody watching, we're going to be talking a little bit about some sensitive topics, but we're going to do it with care and gentleness. But, Elaina, I was wondering, would you just kind of help everybody get to know you a little bit, share a bit about it, your story, and what maybe was the thing that transformed you into this beautiful activist that you are today?
Well, thanks for having me here to share a little bit about my story and journey. Because Ashley, you are someone that I just absolutely respect and admire,
Mm,
and I find such a kinship with you, particularly your journey, because it resonates so much with mine. I mean, very different, of course, but the fact that I grew up in pretty fundamentalist spaces, which at the time
mm,
I didn't realize. And so when I hear you talk about your experiences, unfortunately, it's so common, especially in religious spaces. And that is where, of course, then becomes ripe for abuse. And
mm,
that was my experience. I ended up, you know, serving and leading with some churches that that's all I knew, and I didn't realize how toxic and controlling um, it was. To be in environments where I was told what to think and believe, and not to be allowed to question. And if you did dare to question, then you were somehow seen as less than. So, I grew up in an environment where, I had a very narrow understanding of the Bible and told me as a woman that I had to submit, you know,
mm,
to men and my future husband, and that my goal and worth in life was to get married, have babies, and follow after the will of my spouse. And I really internalize so much of that because, again, I believe these authority figures in my life. And I did all the right things and I subscribed to a purity theology that really focused a lot on, one's body and being modest
Right.
and not having sex before marriage and just, remaining pure and sinless. And again, I look back at it, I'm like, those were always about one's body, one's reproduction, and definitely not about other things that, of course, could be named as sinful. When we think about racism and homophobia and
Right.
whatnot. So, anyways, it's been a journey for me, and for me, my awakening really happened, unfortunately, of course, through my experience as a rape survivor.
Mm,
My first sexual experience was with a Christian
mm,
who violated my body and my sense of self. And that happened my last semester of college, and I walked away from that community and that season of my life just absolutely broken and feeling like I had no worth, that I had done something that was completely unforgivable. And I
mm,
didn't feel safe talking about it with my community because, again, I had absolutely internalized that it was my fault.
mm.
And it has taken many, many years for me to come to a place where I can speak about that, um, and heal. But it has absolutely empowered me to be an activist, particularly in faith spaces, because I recognize just how harmful these teachings can be.
Yeah.
And it's taken me to seminary and working in other faith-based spaces for me to help deconstruct all those toxic things that I had learned, and to then become an activist that offers a different way of looking at scripture, and to be a person that really recognizes the power that we all have to offer, and how much of a responsibility that is as well. And
Mm,
so that has been, yeah, why you end up seeing me in different spaces talking about faith and politics, toxic theology, because it's so intertwined, and especially, when we look at our institutions of control, and those are, religious spaces, those are political spaces. And I have made it my mission to help transform that so that other survivors, do not have to feel alone, and that other generations don't have to grow up in that kind of upbringing.
wow, that is so powerful. And I am so sorry for everything that you've had to suffer. And also, I'm so thankful for your courage. We talk a lot about that here, and the way you came to a place where you value yourself and you value your healing journey, and that is such a beautiful thing. And then now you're turning this as an opportunity to help other people in a similar situation, and in no way, shape, or form am I saying that it was worth it or anything like that,
Mhm.
because there's no excuse or bright side to experiencing abuse and trauma. And also, you've just really developed this way of being in the world that is so supportive to so many people who've gone through painful things. And I just see that activist spirit in you, and it's beautiful, it's inspiring, and so resilient. So thank you for being willing to share that with us today.
Mhm.
And then I wanted to ask you a little bit, as you were talking about kind of deconstructing, and some of our audience, they identify as Christian, some are more conservative, some are more progressive. Some people are of a different faith that's not Christian, some are atheist, agnostic. But I think one thing that can be really helpful for us is most of us are bonding from a place of like, wherever we are in our journey right now, most of our audience here has come from a place where there's been some toxic religious angles. to the abuse we experienced. And so I wondered if you could talk about some of the things that you're noticing or have noticed in the past that can contribute to the suffering of abuse survivors, toxic ideologies and theologies. You mentioned purity culture, which is a big one. And we just had Linda K. Klein on the show a couple weeks ago, and she dove so deep into that. So I'm so glad you brought that up again. That's kind of just the confirmation that we're on the right path with these discussions. But, maybe whether it is the plight of women within faith environments, patriarchy, whether it is the way women of color, men of color, those who are gender, non-binary, how people of color are treated in these movements, and how that can contribute to um, abuse and toxicity, and not being supported when someone comes forward with abuse, or just any of the patterns that you're noticing that you'd maybe like to bring forward as something that we can be aware of, whether we choose to stay in a faith community or not, that these things are not okay. And just kind of dissecting a little bit of kind of how we got here, with survivors not being supported in these communities.
Yes. Oh, so glad you brought up and brought Linda to your show.
Yeah.
Purity culture is so insidious, and that's something I was dealing with in college like 20 years ago,
Right.
and it's still around today, and it's so pervasive because we have goodness, so many churches and religious spaces that teaches that ideology that to be whole, to be pure means that your body has to look a certain way.
Mm,
You have to be a certain way, your own sexuality, your orientation, which is, of course, very hetero, very cisgendered emphasis on relationships, like the only pure relationships are hetero ones. And that is such a red flag, like when we talk about these patterns of abuse. It's just recognizing when you've been taught something that is just so narrow and does not leave room for other experiences. That
mm,
there are families and loving relationships that are not hetero. And for me, that was one of the first red flags of just
mm,
recognizing, wow, we have such a narrow understanding of sexuality, and then which relationships are valid, and
right.
then how those relationships are practiced.
Yeah.
Then you get into the complementarian and egalitarian worldviews. Egalitarian, of course, teaches that women, men, all genders are equal and one and the same, and despite their do not have roles that subscribe them to particular ways of being. Whereas complementarianism, I know you've talked a lot about and so much good work to deconstruct that. That is a very narrow understanding that women, specifically cis women, have a very narrow way that they're supposed to act. When I'm talking about babies and getting married and submitting to one's husband, specifically
Right.
husband.
Yeah. Yes.
That's complementarianism, and that creates this rape culture, frankly, in
Right.
our churches, because that was very much my experience, and I've heard a lot of other church survivors describe it the same way, that when you've been taught that there's just this one way of being, and then if anything goes outside of that, then you're looked at as you know that it's your fault, that you are
Right.
otherized and less than. And it is so incredibly harmful what we are doing to those in our pews and outside our pews. Like, no wonder
Mm,
people are leaving the church. I don't blame them, frankly. And I have a deep respect and regard for those who want to stay in a church, who want to transform it, and also honor those who want to focus on their healing and put up a
mm.
boundary and say that they will not be a part of church communities.
Right. Healing
That
comes
is
in so many
that is
different
incredible.
shapes for different people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that. Wow.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, well that's really helpful discussion, and I think what a lot of people haven't seen maybe until recently is that experiencing rape culture and abuse within religious communities, and in this context we're talking about Christianity, but it is across the board in all faith communities, um, that it isn't just a few bad actors. It's actually a culture that's created where belief systems are put in place and rules are put in place that are actually attracting dangerous people and excusing dangerous people. And we've got to be mindful of, talking about those things, whether it is patriarchy, whether it is purity culture, whether it is racism, whether it is homophobia, whether it is ableism, all of those things, and just realizing that it's not just something that just happened. It's a deeply rooted issue, and I know that in a lot of your work in deconstructing and kind of looking at these issues, the idea of choice has come up for you, and you've kind of really focused on this idea of choice for women. And then I want to maybe focus on that for a few minutes around abuse survivors. And what kind of brought you to this idea of choice being so important for abuse survivors? Why is it important? What does choice mean? Because I think it's a broad term, and just what I feel like what I looked at your work, that's something that I've kind of pulled out as like one of your key messages is, um, with patriarchy, with racism, with sexism, with homophobia, that is putting people in boxes that they don't have a choice for. Same with abuse. And so, can you just talk to us about choice and how that comes together with the survivor experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I have to say that nothing is more sacred than one's choice,
Mm,
one's agency, and
yeah.
bodily autonomy. Um, I came into working predominantly, women's rights, specifically against, advocating against violence against women and upholding reproductive health rights and justice because of my experience as
Mm,
a rape survivor. I know what it's like to have someone's will be forced upon me,
right.
and I don't want that for anyone else. And that coercion happens on so many levels. We see it in the ways that women and other queer folks are silenced in church spaces and beyond. Um, we see it in the coercion of women's bodies and pregnant people. I do a
Mm-hmm.
lot of work on abortion rights, and that's
Mm-hmm.
because I believe so much in bodily autonomy that, one should not be coerced and forced into birth. And that reproductive coercion just happens over and over again by the ways
Mm,
that we dictate, whether someone should have access to birth control and when and how they get pregnant and build their
mm,
families. And so it all comes back to choice for me because that agency, is
mm.
taken away from me.
Yeah.
And there is few things more beautiful than people finding their voice
Yeah.
and learning to advocate for themselves. And part of that is reclaiming one's
Mm,
voice and one's choice and agency. Um, and so it's so central to who
yeah.
we are, whether you're a person of faith or not, to believe that someone has human dignity and free will to
Right.
decide how to live their lives, who they love, what they do with their bodies, and the state should not have control over that, and
Mm,
certainly not the church.
right.
So that is choice is everything. I mean,
Mm,
it's what makes us human, and to strip people's dignity of that by denying them their choice and free
mm,
will is just outrageous.
Yeah.
Me.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think closely tied with choice is consent.
Mhm.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, but I sort of see consent as like um, not passive may be the wrong word, but like passive in that like you're allowing something,
Mhm.
whereas choice is maybe more the active form of that word where you're like pursuing something. I don't know, but I would love to hear your thoughts about kind of the similarities between consent and choice, if there's differences, how they work and play
Mhm.
together, if you have any thoughts. Just as you were speaking about, autonomy, choice, I was just thinking consent, and they're similar, but they're not quite the same. And I'd love to
Right.
hear maybe your
Ooh.
piecing together that.
Ooh. Wow. You got me thinking here because in some ways I think they are one and the same. You cannot have choice without that active consent.
Mm,
Someone really being able to say yes to something
right.
actively. I mean, I guess I look at it the other way. The consent is the active
Mm,
part.
got it.
It does come down to that because there are many choices, there are many options, but in some ways, they can be false choices for
Got it.
people who may not, because of circumstances, may not be able to use their full range of choices or options.
Right.
Again, when I think about reproductive rights, um, not everyone can decide what kind of future they want, whether to raise a family
Mm,
or not, because they may be experiencing, um, you know, food insecurity, homelessness, and a variety of other systemic issues that then negates one's choice. And so,
right.
um, yeah, but they are one and the same in this fact that, yeah, one needs to be able to consent,
Mm,
especially when it comes to your body and the way that the decisions you get to actively make in your life. Um, it is so central. So that's some good food for thought. I'm gonna have to chew on that a little bit
mm,
more because, yeah, consent. We teach that so much in our work
right.
because, I mean, yeah, if it's not, then it's just coercion, and
Exactly.
those are some of the ugly truths that
Mm,
end up happening in our faith
right.
spaces, and oh gosh, no, I just
Yeah.
go on about that.
Right.
Ah,
That makes a lot of sense. And kind of what you're saying about, I don't remember exactly how you worded it, but like not all choices are options for people, and
mhm,
certain choices are kind of, and it just made me think of the term bounded choice that
mm,
I have heard a lot, particularly around, I think I first heard the term as I was coming out as a stay at home daughter and leaving
mm,
that stay at home daughter movement, and how somebody can put in front of you two choices, but you know obviously there are natural consequences to any choice that you make, but then there's
right.
sometimes punishments for a choice that you make which are not natural consequences but are enforced by other people. And so for instance, um, you know on one hand it would be like, well, it's your choice to be a stay-at-home daughter and submit to your father till he gives you away in marriage to another man to submit to. And on one hand, it looks like you have that free will choice, but the choice to leave that could mean that you are cut off from your whole community, which could also mean that you don't have money, job security, food, shelter, education, those kinds of things. And so, while I guess it's technically a choice, it's a bounded choice, and that one is coming with not just natural consequences but also with a punishment if you choose the quote unquote wrong choice. And I've seen that kind of thing play out for survivors so many times, working with like child marriage survivors as well. And just the things that have been forced upon them, even the way our laws are formed and shaped. A lot of times it's again kind of a bounded choice situation where it's not a true free choice where you can choose either one of these things. It's really a pressure to choose one way, and that doesn't seem like informed free consent. And
Mhm.
um Yeah, I just think it's so interesting how consent and choice play into each other. And yeah, this is a good conversation, and you're getting my wheels spinning and turning, and I'm just thinking about these from new angles. And so yeah, thank you for sharing your wisdom on all of that. Yeah, yeah. Um, and I wanted to ask you, because you're such an advocate of people choosing their destiny, what are some of your top suggestions for survivors to kind of reclaim that autonomy, to reclaim that choice? And maybe secondarily, what are some ways that advocates and people who want to support survivors can really get behind survivors being able to make those choices?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's a huge healing journey. It's a big question
Mm,
about how do you get um, to a place of continual healing, because I feel like I'm always in recovery, but I think a lot of it starts with recognizing that it's not your fault.
mm,
Naming that, at least for me, was incredibly powerful. Um, Finally getting language around it and just being able to recognize that, because again, everything that I was taught and internalized and all these bounded choices um, really led to the situation where then I blamed myself,
mm,
and you see it all the time, and you see in this rape
mm.
culture where people say, oh, because they were wearing this or they were drinking or they were
Yeah,
in the wrong place. And at the end of the day, no, it has nothing to do
right,
with that, and all about the onus is on the other person
right.
and their violation of you. So starting just recognizing how healing that is, that it's not one's fault, and
Mm.
then
And can I
finding
stop you right there? Because that
mhm.
is just so good. It just had this thought through my mind. It's like, before you can take your choice back, you have to realize when your choice was taken away so you can know the difference and put off that guilt and be able to
Mhm.
realize when you actually were at cause and when you were not. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because that shame is powerful, but
Mm.
it's not
Yeah,
what you did. It's
right,
not
right.
does not define you
Yeah.
by any means. And then, yes, you get to consent and reclaim your power and move forward um, bit by bit. As you
Mm.
know, with the healing journey,
Yeah,
it's never just
yeah.
linear. But part of finding that power again
Mm.
comes with, again, recognizing it's not your fault, and then I feel like it's then comes recognizing that you're not alone. The more
Mm.
that we tell our stories, that's what I love about your work, Ashley, because the more you tell your stories, the more you give
Mm.
permission for people to recognize that they're not alone, that there is a community, people out there
Mm.
who have experienced the same stigma and shame and
Yeah.
controlling behaviors and toxic theologies. And that helps people begin to heal and deconstruct.
Mm.
And then I find that you can begin to trust your voice again, begin to
Mm.
trust yourself. Um, because it's so layered, getting to a place where you can um, recognize again that it's not your fault, then
Yeah.
that means you have to start believing yourself.
Mm.
As much as you want others to believe you, you have to believe in your own worth and your own agency and power to not let this control you. Though
Right.
again, not your fault if you spiral and you have bad days and you get triggered, because that is that is unfortunately the journey. But it is
Mm.
beautiful when you can hear other stories and be in community with others, reclaim your power. And I would say for those who want to walk alongside and accompany survivors, be a trustworthy person. Be
Mm.
a person that someone can trust with their stories,
Yeah.
that they trust you to hold that you would be someone who would believe them without question.
Mm.
That is just priceless. And it sounds so simple, but we live in a culture that does not believe survivors. We see it over and over again with the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, that too many women, girls, femmes are not believed. And it starts with us. It starts with our allies, with those who want to journey with us. They have to be accomplices. They have
Yeah.
to actually, you know, do more than just, ally with us, but be an accomplice, get into good trouble, put yourself on the line, count the cost of what it would look like for you to stand up and say that you believe someone,
Mm,
because that survivor, they carry that burden. Be someone who carries it with them, not
mm,
for them. They're
yeah.
strong enough, they can do that, but they want and need community support. And
Mm,
that's yeah, it's that community that will help bring so much healing and validity and credibility and support that we need. We all need that in every sphere of our lives, especially if you're a survivor.
yeah. Yeah. That's great. So I'm just kind of like synthesizing that down, and it's kind of like, you first need to understand when your choice is taken away, when you've had autonomy, and be able to kind of recognize that you deserve to have choice, and then feeling again like you get to choose what happens next with your story, whether you share it with a small group of people or with a lot of people or whatever. Like, that's your choice as to how you use your story. It belongs to you. And then finding your voice again, whether that is directly related to your story or whether that's just taking back your power in other areas of life that maybe aren't as explicitly about the abuse that occurred. But oftentimes there's this pattern with abuse that's not just the physical act or a one-time thing. It's often putting people's self-esteem down, and so kind of finding your voice again and your power again in every area of life. And I love how you talked about, advocates and people supporting survivors can really be that safe community holding their stories well. And another thing that came to my mind is I think sometimes a lot of people who want to be helpers can sometimes take away the choice of survivors in their attempts to help because they feel they know best. And maybe they do know technically the best way to handle a situation, but it always has to be up to the survivor as to what they feel is best for themselves in that moment, and giving them the time to process through and see all their options. And so maybe even as advocates, remembering that we can give information, but at the end of the day, we need to step back and allow adult survivors to make their decisions. And of course, with children, child abuse, we need to report to the police, and that's a whole different story. But um, kind of affirming that autonomy, even if the choice isn't one that we ourselves would make.
Yes. Oh, that's a good word. And I would add, let's talk about race here a little bit. For advocates, I think they have to check their white saviorism.
Mm, yes.
That happens so much. People, meanwhile, they want to fix any problems, but at the end of the day, it's not about you. And that is a word for white allies and accomplices, but it's also a word for uh, survivors of color, because
Mm,
it's so layered, the ways that we are abused and oppressed. And um, a lot of advocates need to come to a place where they understand more of the experiences of survivors of color, that is in many ways a double oppression, for me as a
mm,
woman and as an Asian woman, a woman of color. Um, it comes with my sexuality being fetishized and
mm,
hypersexualized in ways that other bodies are not. And so that
mm,
is very common for a lot of Black, Brown, Indigenous folks. And to recognize that then, we end up um, being controlled and commodified in these spaces that look at our bodies as objects. And it's a different layer. Not it's not oppression Olympics by any ways, but it is a different understanding of the ways that we experience abuse. Among survivors of color, it's going to be
mm,
different
yeah.
with the white survivors. And And it's going to be different for the ways that advocates need to engage and respect, especially, spaces where we honor people's telling their stories when they're ready, but that
Mm,
may look like that they're only ready to share those spaces with, you know, black folks only or brown folks only, and
mm,
not a mixed group. So yeah, just recognizing that we live in a world where, I mean, it's complex, it's
mm,
beautiful, and I love my various identities, but it also leads to different biases, and
mm,
that needs, yeah, that's a part of our healing journey, but it's a part of the advocacy journey, and it's a part of
mm.
how we support different survivors.
Yeah, no, that is so, so important. And
Mm.
anybody who's listening to this and would like to learn a little bit more about how there is an intersection of, different pieces of oppression that can go into abuse. Alexis Douglas is doing our series once a month and talking about these concepts. And so you can definitely check out our back episodes, and we'll have another one up in a few weeks. But yeah, thank you so much for bringing that forward for us. Such an important word for people to understand, and a space to grow in for white folks like myself. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Well, I would love for our audience to be able to get to know you and your work a bit more. How can they follow you? How can they read your articles, see what you're about, all the things?
Yeah. Well, as in our digital age, you can find me online. Social media, of course. My handle for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram is Elena Bueno. And you can find some of my work there, a little insight into my life and all the great causes and people that I champion. And then a lot of my work, faithfully pro choice, reproductive rights advocacy work, is found with the Ohio Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And all of our work, our blog, our podcast, and advocacy can be found at ohiorcrc.org. So,
Beautiful.
I mean, those are some of the main spaces. And, you know, Google is our friend. Check out some of my articles. Reach out if you have any questions. Um, yeah, I'm, I love meeting and working with a lot of different groups. And so, yeah, as
Mm,
you noted, Ashley, I work with sometimes Red Letter Christians. I'm on their board
mhm.
and was their former interim executive director and editor. So, do a lot of work with them and a lot of work in Ohio. So, if you are in
Yes.
the Midwest, come through.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you so much for sharing that. Everybody, definitely check out Elena's social media and websites. You can check her out at. Thank you so much for being here today. This is really valuable information. I know I learned a lot, and I know our audience was just eating up everything you were saying. So thank you. Awesome.
Friend.
And everybody, make sure you also follow Courage 365 on all our social media platforms. We've got Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. You can find us on all of those places there. And you can also pop on over to our website, courage365.org. And just for visiting our website, you can download our free ebook, 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage. It's a book to help you take your next most courageous steps in your survivor journey. We also have a couple of other exciting things that we've introduced to Courage 365 recently. For one, you can watch all the back episodes of the Courage Conversation Show either on our website or on YouTube, but we've also just put them in podcast format, so you can search for that wherever you get your podcasts and listen to them in that format. We have our Need Help tab on our website if you are in a situation where you would like support. We've got hotlines, supportive blogs, and websites. But of course, if you know or suspect child abuse, if you're in imminent danger, please do reach out to the authorities. We've also started a new opportunity where you can receive text messages from us every morning, written by survivors for survivors. These are empowering messages to kind of give you that shot in the morning, shot in the arm of courage to help you really live an expansive, healing life. So, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, live with courage.